It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in the small suburban town of Willow Creek. Jasmine Matthews, a 29-year-old accountant, had just achieved what she considered a significant milestone. After years of hard work and sacrificing her personal life, she had finally saved enough to buy her dream car, a brand-new, sleek black Mercedes-Benz. It was her symbol of success, a testament to her dedication and resilience. She parked the car outside her favorite coffee shop, the place where she usually grabbed her morning cup before heading to the office. The sun was still low, casting a warm golden glow on the quiet streets, and the town was just waking up. Jasmine stepped out of the car, feeling a surge of pride. She could still remember the day she'd walked into the dealership, unsure if she could even afford it, only to leave with keys in hand. As she walked toward the entrance of the cafe, she glanced back at her car one last time, basking in the pride of finally achieving something for herself. Little did she know that would be the last time she'd see it for a long while. Inside the cafe, she ordered her usual, a medium caramel latte, and took a seat by the window, scrolling through her phone. Outside, across the street, Officer Davis was on his routine patrol. He had been working in Willow Creek for almost a decade, known to the locals as a quiet, dependable cop who did his job well. But today, something about the car caught his attention. A black Mercedes-Benz, parked in a prime spot, practically begging to be noticed. He'd seen it before. It belonged to Jasmine Matthews, a young woman who was always in and out of the cafe at the same time every day. But there was something about today that felt different, something that tugged at him, urging him to act on an impulse. Davis had been struggling for months with his finances. His debts were mounting, and his side job as a mechanic wasn't enough to cover the bills. That's when his gaze fell on the car. He knew it wasn't just any car. It was expensive, flashy, and perfect for what he needed. He had never stolen anything in his life, but today, in the quiet hum of the morning, the temptation felt overwhelming. He scanned the street. No one was paying attention, and Jasmine was safely inside the cafe, oblivious to what was about to happen. His heartbeat quickened as he made the snap decision. He could take the car, hide it somewhere, and no one would be the wiser. He'd drive it for a few days, make it disappear, then sell it. The money could clear his debts, give him a fresh start. He wouldn't get caught, he told himself. He was a cop after all. He knew how to cover his tracks. Davis glanced at his uniform. He was a cop, in full view of the public, and yet here he was contemplating a crime. It wasn't like he didn't have a sense of right and wrong, but desperation had clouded his judgment. In a heartbeat, he unlocked the car, slipped inside, and started the engine. The smooth hum of the Mercedes was a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside his chest. As he drove away, he felt an uneasy sense of freedom, but there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat in the cafe, completely unaware. She checked her watch. Her coffee break was nearly over. She was due at the office in 15 minutes. She had no reason to suspect that her perfect morning was about to come crashing down around her. But when she stepped out of the cafe, the first thing she noticed was the empty parking space where her car had been. For a moment, she stood frozen, not quite understanding what had happened. She walked to the spot where her car had been, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't there. She spun around, scanning the parking lot, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she parked it somewhere else. But no, her car was gone. Her first thought was that she might have parked in the wrong spot. But no, she had parked right in front of the cafe, where she always did. Panic began to creep in, followed by disbelief. Was it really stolen? No, that couldn't be. She called out to a man walking past, asking if he had seen anyone near her car. The man shook his head, oblivious. Jasmine quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher answered. My car has been stolen. Jasmine replied, her voice shaking. It was parked right in front of the cafe. A black Mercedes-Benz, Please, you have to help me." The dispatcher took down the details, assuring her they would send someone immediately. Jasmine's mind raced as she stood there, staring at the empty parking spot. She couldn't believe it. Her car, her dream, was gone in an instant, and with it, a sense of safety and security she had taken for granted. For the first time in years, she felt exposed, vulnerable, unsure of what to do next. As Jasmine anxiously paced back and forth, Officer Davis was already miles away, his conscience gnawing at him with each passing second. The car, the thrill of taking it, it felt wrong, but there was no turning back now. He couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to live with himself after this. Jasmine paced the sidewalk outside the cafe, her eyes glued to the empty parking spot where her car had been moments before. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. It was as if her entire world had shifted in the blink of an eye. Her hand shook as she dialed 911 again, praying it was some sort of misunderstanding. She asked if there was any news yet, but the dispatcher, polite but distant, informed her that the police were still on their way. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Jasmine decided to take matters into her own hands. She wasn't going to sit around and wait for someone else to find her car. This was her dream, her hard-earned success, and someone had just stolen it. She turned on her heels and walked briskly to the nearest coffee shop to ask around if anyone had seen anything suspicious. The barista, a young woman with a sleepy look in her eyes, barely looked up as Jasmine approached. "Did you see anyone near my car?" "A black Mercedes." Jasmine's voice trembled slightly, though she was doing her best to keep it steady. The barista shrugged, still distracted by her phone. "I didn't notice anything. Was it parked there long?" Jasmine felt a sense of disbelief growing in her chest. She wasn't getting any help here. She walked back outside, this time scanning the street with more focus, hoping for some clue, some sign that could lead her to her car. Nothing. The town was still, the morning calm, and yet she was caught in a storm of panic. An hour passed, then two. The police hadn't arrived yet, and Jasmine's anxiety grew with each minute. She went back to the coffee shop and tried to keep herself busy with some paperwork, but her mind was consumed by the thought of her car. It wasn't just about the vehicle itself. It was everything it represented. The countless hours of overtime at her job, the sacrifices she'd made, the bills she'd paid with little more than the hope that one day things would get easier. That car had symbolized her ability to overcome, to rise above the struggles of her past. And now, it was gone. Meanwhile, Officer Davis drove down a deserted highway on the outskirts of town, the stolen car humming steadily beneath him. His heart pounded as he glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights closing in on him. He had driven aimlessly for what seemed like hours, but in reality, it had only been 30 minutes. He didn't know where he was going, but the farther he got from Willow Creek, the less likely anyone would find him. He kept telling himself that no one would suspect him, that the car would disappear, and everything would go back to normal. But the guilt was already eating away at him, a constant, gnawing sensation that wouldn't go away. At every intersection, Davis debated whether to stop and think this through. Should he just call it off, turn around, and return the car? But he knew that once he did that, there would be no going back. He couldn't face Jasmine, couldn't look her in the eye, and explain what he had done. He didn't even know why he had taken the car. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was the pressure. But in that moment, as he drove deeper into the rural countryside, his decision was made, and there was no turning back. Back in town, Jasmine's frustration was reaching a boiling point. She stood outside, waiting, staring at the empty parking lot where her car used to be, hoping for a miracle. The officers had finally arrived, and were taking their time interviewing witnesses and checking the security cameras at the cafe. But the footage, as it turned out, was unclear. The camera angles were blocked by trees, and the quality was poor. It wasn't much help. She felt like she was in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Hours passed. By late afternoon, Jasmine was back home, pacing the floors of her small apartment. She had called everyone she knew, but no one had any useful information. The police, though they had filed a report, were more concerned with other cases. After all, a stolen car in a small town like Willow Creek wasn't exactly top priority. They assured her they'd look into it, but Jasmine had no faith in their ability to find anything, let alone the person who had taken her car. Her phone buzzed. A text from her brother. "Have you heard anything? The news is saying there's a lot of car thefts happening lately. Could be a trend." Jasmine's mind reeled. It was all starting to feel like a conspiracy, like someone was playing her. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The officer, the one person who should have been protecting her, was the one who had taken her car. The weight of the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She couldn't shake the image of Officer Davis, the way he had looked at her car earlier that morning, the strange way he had acted when she asked about it. The pieces started to fall into place. What if it wasn't just a random thief? What if it was someone who knew her, someone who had been watching her? Jasmine couldn't rest. She grabbed her keys and headed out again, determined to find out the truth. As she drove around the small streets, the quiet town felt different. It felt like a place she didn't recognize anymore. Everywhere she looked, she saw shadows. Every parked car seemed to be hiding a secret. And then, without warning, the real fear hit her. What if she was wrong? What if she had no idea who had taken her car and was just chasing ghosts? But there was no going back now. The suspicion, the gut feeling that something was off, it had taken root. Jasmine wasn't going to sit idly by while someone she trusted betrayed her. She was going to find the person responsible, even if it meant confronting them herself. The police couldn't help her, so it was up to her. Unbeknownst to her, Officer Davis was already feeling the consequences of his actions. The further he drove, the worse he felt, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as the weight of the decision settled in. He glanced at the rearview mirror once more, as if searching for a way out, but the only thing staring back at him was his own reflection. And in that reflection, he saw a man who had crossed a line, one that he couldn't come back from. The tension in Willow Creek had been building ever since the stolen car was reported. Jasmine's sense of urgency grew with each passing day, as did her resolve to uncover the truth. Her trust in the police had begun to waver, and every time she thought about Officer Davis, the knot in her stomach tightened. He had been the one to reassure her that everything would be okay. Yet she couldn't shake the gut feeling that something was off. The more she thought about it, the more everything pointed back to him. He was the one who had been patrolling the area the day her car was taken, the one who had been right there when she parked. And the more she replayed their brief interactions in her mind, the more she became certain. Jasmine wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Despite the uncertainty of what she might find, she began her own investigation, scouring the neighborhood, speaking to locals, and asking around at the cafe. Most people had seen nothing unusual, but one old woman, Mrs. Green, mentioned seeing Davis' car parked near the spot where her Mercedes had been. At the time, Mrs. Green hadn't thought much of it, but now, in light of the situation, it seemed suspicious. Armed with this new information, Jasmine decided to follow her instincts. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to uncover, but she knew she had to act. That evening, she drove through the outskirts of town, keeping a close eye on every car parked along the side streets. Her heart raced with each passing minute, the shadows of doubt still looming over her every step. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but the thought of her stolen car, of her dreams shattered, pushed her forward. As fate would have it, Jasmine drove by a secluded area on the edge of town, a small wooded lot where Davis often took his breaks to unwind. There, parked under the cover of a large oak tree, was the unmistakable silhouette of her black Mercedes. Her heart skipped a beat. It was too much of a coincidence. Jasmine parked her car a few feet away, heart pounding in her chest. She had to know if it was really her car. She had to confront Davis, but she wasn't sure how. As she sat in her car, staring at the stolen vehicle, her thoughts raced. Was this the moment when she would finally expose the man who had betrayed her? Or was it just another case of her imagination getting the best of her? Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she debated whether to get out and confront him. Her gut told her this was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The truth was within reach. She stepped out of her car cautiously, walking towards the Mercedes. Every step felt like it took her deeper into the unknown. She didn't know what she would find, what Davis' reaction would be, but she had to know. She reached the car, the familiar black paint gleaming in the moonlight. She peered inside, and her breath caught in her throat. There, on the passenger seat, were the keys to her Mercedes. She couldn't believe it. It was as if she had stumbled upon the final piece of the puzzle. Before she could process what to do next, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stepped back quickly, hiding behind a nearby bush. Through the leaves, she could see Officer Davis walking towards the car. His gait was slow, deliberate, as if he were lost in thought. Jasmine's heart raced as she watched him stop beside her car, pausing to look around. He was checking his surroundings, paranoid, nervous. She had to act now. With a deep breath, she stepped forward and called out his name. Officer Davis. He froze, his eyes widening in surprise as he turned around to face her. His face was a mask of confusion, but Jasmine could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly who she was. Jasmine, he said, his voice laced with an edge of nervousness. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Jasmine replied, her voice steady but filled with anger. This is my car, officer. Why is it here? Davis took a step back, visibly sweating now. He looked at her, then at the car, then back at her, unsure of how to respond. I don't know what you're talking about. This isn't your car. Jasmine took a few steps closer, her gaze unwavering. I've been looking for this car everywhere. I know it's mine. The keys, the interior, it's all the same. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. You stole my car, didn't you? Davis swallowed hard, his face growing pale. No, it's not what you think. Jasmine's anger flared. You took it. I know you did. You were the only one who had the chance. You knew exactly where I parked it. You knew exactly what it meant to me. Her voice rose, the frustration of days spent searching, the confusion, the betrayal. It all boiled over in that moment. Davis stepped back, his eyes darting around, as if trying to find a way out of the confrontation. Jasmine, please. This isn't what it looks like. I wasn't thinking straight. You weren't thinking straight. Jasmine interrupted, her voice cutting through the silence. You're a police officer. You took an oath to protect people, not steal from them. You stole from me, Officer Davis. I trusted you. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Davis could feel his facade crumbling, the guilt of his actions flooding in, overwhelming him. He had justified it in his mind, told himself it would all work out. But now, standing before the very person he had wronged, there was no escaping the reality of what he had done. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know what else to do. I needed the money. Jasmine stood there, stunned. She had expected anger, but not this. Not an apology that seemed so hollow, so weak. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of rage and disappointment. You think an apology is enough? She asked, her voice cold. You stole my car, and you think saying sorry is going to fix this. You've destroyed my trust. And for what? To cover your debts. Davis opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say to make it right. The silence hung heavy between them. Jasmine looked at him one last time before turning to leave. She had the proof she needed. She had confronted the man who had stolen from her. And now she was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. The consequences of Davis' actions had only just begun to unfold. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a sense of disbelief for both Jasmine and Officer Davis, but in very different ways. Jasmine had uncovered the truth, but the weight of that truth was more complicated than she could have imagined. The small town of Willow Creek had never experienced anything like this, and the ripple effects of her discovery were felt far beyond her own life. Officer Davis, the once respected cop who had been the very symbol of trust in their community, was now a figure of suspicion, and Jasmine's life, once full of quiet stability, had been turned upside down in ways she hadn't anticipated. Jasmine knew what she had to do. She couldn't just let this slide. But as she sat in her small apartment that night, staring at her phone, the reality of taking action started to sink in. How would she report Officer Davis? She knew how small towns worked, how rumors spread like wildfire, and how deeply people could be loyal to those they thought they knew. Would she be seen as a troublemaker, someone stirring the pot for no reason? Or would they believe her? The fear of being disbelieved was an unwelcome companion, and the town's silence made it harder to find a path forward. The police department had already heard whispers, though. Davis had been a well-known face, and as soon as his name was connected to the stolen car, people began to question everything they had ever known about him. He had been the go-to officer for many, someone people trusted with their safety and well-being. But trust is fragile, and it can crumble faster than you think. The community had already begun to divide over the news. Some still defended Davis, choosing to believe that there had to be an explanation, while others were quick to call for his resignation. Jasmine wasn't sure if she wanted the public spectacle that was about to unfold. She just wanted justice, to get back what had been taken from her. But as soon as she went public with her findings, she realized there was no turning back. Her decision would affect everyone. The pressure mounted as the investigation began, and Davis' career teetered on the brink of collapse. Officer Davis had spent the night after his confrontation with Jasmine in his car, parked on a desolate road just outside town. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and there was no way to undo what he had done. He had convinced himself for so long that he could manage the situation, that the money would solve everything, that the people around him wouldn't notice the signs of desperation. But the truth had come crashing down on him with the force of a freight train, and now he was left to deal with the fallout. His phone buzzed repeatedly, but he ignored it, not wanting to face anyone. His once unshakable confidence had been shattered, replaced with a mounting fear. The community was beginning to turn on him, and he had nowhere to hide. His reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and the whispers behind closed doors were growing louder. Even his fellow officers, once friends and colleagues, began to distance themselves. The trust he had spent years building had evaporated in the span of a few moments. Jasmine, on the other hand, found herself standing at the precipice of a life-altering decision. She had reported Davis to the authorities, and now the investigation was in full swing. But every time she thought about it, she felt conflicted. On one hand, she wanted justice. On the other, she was seeing the destruction of a man who had been a respected member of their community. Was this the right thing to do? Was bringing him down the answer, or had she just made a situation worse for everyone involved? The more Jasmine reflected on her actions, the more she realized that what she was dealing with was bigger than just her. It was a problem that affected the entire community. What did it say about their society that someone like Officer Davis could have slipped through the cracks for so long? What did it say about their perception of law enforcement and their willingness to ignore the signs of corruption and wrongdoing? These questions lingered in Jasmine's mind, leaving her wondering if the truth was enough to bring about change, or if the damage was already done. As the investigation continued, the tension in Willow Creek reached a boiling point. The local news stations began to pick up the story, and what had initially seemed like a small-town incident became a national talking point. People from all over the country weighed in, sharing their opinions on the actions of Officer Davis and the courage of Jasmine to speak out. But the more attention the case garnered, the more Jasmine began to feel like a pawn in a larger game. Her face was now plastered on news outlets, her name spread across social media. She had gone from a quiet woman with a simple life to the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. And then came the phone call. It was late at night, the kind of call Jasmine never expected to get. She was curled up in bed, trying to shut out the noise of the day when her phone rang. She answered it, her voice hesitant, unsure of what was coming. "Jasmine," the voice on the other end said. "It's Davis." Her heart stopped. It had been days since she'd last seen him, since their confrontation. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, certainly not like this. I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice cold but steady. "You've already made your choice. I didn't want it to end this way," Davis said, his voice breaking. "I've lost everything, Jasmine. My career, my family. You don't understand. I didn't know how far I had fallen until it was too late." Jasmine's grip tightened around the phone. She had no sympathy left for him. She had seen what he had done, how he had lied, how he had stolen from her without a second thought. But something in his voice, something that sounded almost desperate, made her hesitate. "You don't get to tell me what you didn't know," she replied firmly. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Davis sighed, a sound filled with resignation. "I know. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't expect it to come to this. But I don't know how to fix it. I can't undo what I've done." Jasmine stayed silent for a moment, the weight of everything heavy on her shoulders. Was there any way for either of them to walk away from this? The answer was clear. There was no undoing the damage. It was done. And as painful as it was, Jasmine had to continue forward, no matter the consequences. The fallout had only just begun. The town was changing, and so was she. The question now wasn't whether she had done the right thing. It was what would happen next. Would Davis find redemption? Would the community ever trust their law enforcement again? These were the questions that loomed over Willow Creek, unanswered, waiting to be resolved in the days to come. The days following her phone call with Officer Davis felt like a whirlwind for Jasmine. She had expected some sort of closure once the truth had come out, but instead, she found herself caught in a never-ending cycle of questions, media attention, and unexpected twists. The town had divided into factions. There were those who stood behind her, rallying around the woman who had exposed a betrayal that no one had seen coming. Then there were those who believed that Davis had simply made a mistake, that one poor decision didn't define a man's life. These people called her actions a witch hunt, claiming that it was more about personal vendetta than justice. Jasmine had never imagined her life would be this chaotic. She had only wanted what was hers, what she had worked so hard for. But now she was at the center of a storm, and no matter how much she tried to escape it, she was constantly pulled back in. The media, the reporters, the constant calls. It felt like every part of her life was on display for the world to judge. It was exhausting. She had become more than just a victim of theft. She had become a symbol, a figurehead for something larger than herself. She didn't ask for it, didn't want it. But it was too late to back out now. The investigation into Officer Davis had taken on a life of its own. The police department, under pressure from both the public and the higher-ups, had started to crack down hard. A full internal investigation was launched, and rumors about Davis's involvement in other shady activities began to surface. Some claimed that his financial troubles had been festering for years, but it was only now, with this car theft, that the truth was coming to light. What had once seemed like a simple mistake turned out to be the tip of the iceberg. The more they dug into his past, the more disturbing revelations came to the surface. For Davis, it was a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. The guilt from his actions had already weighed him down, but now the consequences were becoming unbearable. He had lost his job, his reputation, and even his friends. He was isolated, living in a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of town. He had no contact with anyone from his past life. He hadn't even been able to bring himself to face his family. He knew they would never look at him the same way again. His once proud career was in ruins, and no matter how much he tried to justify his actions in his mind, he knew there was no coming back from this. His life, as he knew it, was over. Jasmine's thoughts were often consumed by the case, but a small part of her still couldn't shake the image of Davis, the way he had looked at her when he confessed, the brokenness in his eyes that mirrored her own sense of loss. It was easy to feel angry and vindictive when someone wrongs you, but when that someone is as vulnerable as Davis appeared to be, it's harder to know what to feel. She had spent countless hours thinking about what her next step should be. Part of her wanted him to pay for his crime in full, for the justice system to hold him accountable for the pain and betrayal he had caused. But another part of her wondered if that would be enough. Would it give her back the peace she had lost? Would it restore the trust in herself and in the people around her? It was a question that haunted her, one that she couldn't easily answer. And then came the letter. It arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot without any warning. Jasmine didn't recognize the handwriting, but as she picked it up and read the first few words, her heart sank. It was from Officer Davis. At first, she thought it was another apology, another attempt to make amends. But as she read further, she realized it was something else entirely. Davis had written to her not just to apologize, but to explain himself, to lay bare the circumstances that had led to his fateful decision. The letter was full of raw emotion, of regret and sorrow. He had outlined the financial strain he had been under for years, how the mounting debts had crushed him, how he had resorted to desperate measures in a moment of weakness. But what struck Jasmine the most was the final line of the letter. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to hurt anyone." Jasmine held the letter in her hands for a long time, staring at the words. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness wash over her. This wasn't the man she had confronted days earlier, the man whose actions had been driven by greed and desperation. This was a broken man, someone who had lost sight of everything he had ever stood for, someone who had been so consumed by his problems that he had made an unforgivable choice. But was it enough? Could she find it in herself to forgive him? It was then that Jasmine realized something crucial. Forgiveness wasn't just for Davis, it was for her too. She had been so focused on punishing him, on making him pay for what he had done, that she hadn't stopped to think about the toll it was taking on her own soul. She had been carrying around so much anger and resentment, but at the end of the day, those feelings were only holding her back. If she didn't let go, if she didn't find a way to forgive, not necessarily for Davis's sake, but for her own peace of mind, she would never be able to move on. She didn't know what the future held for Davis. Whether he would face jail time or be given another chance was not something she could control. But one thing was certain. Jasmine had to make peace with the situation, and that meant accepting the complexities of life. It wasn't black and white. People made mistakes, sometimes the worst kind of mistakes, and while there were consequences, there was also room for redemption. Jasmine folded the letter and placed it in a drawer where it would remain, her final connection to the man who had taken so much from her. She closed the drawer and stood up, looking out the window at the town she had known her entire life. It had changed, yes, but so had she. She had found strength she didn't know she had, learned lessons she never would have expected, and confronted the hard truths about trust, betrayal, and forgiveness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be scars that remained, but the journey of healing was one she had to take, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The town, too, would heal, in its own way, as the wounds left by Davis's betrayal slowly began to fade. Time, she knew, would move forward. And so would she. As the weeks passed, the quiet of Willow Creek seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness, like a town holding its breath. Jasmine had returned to her life, the one she had carefully rebuilt, but everything felt different now. The shadows of what had happened still loomed over her. though she had done her best to move forward. The car was gone, but the sense of betrayal remained, a quiet ache that lingered in her heart. The community, too, was trying to move on. Conversations that once revolved around the weather or the latest local news were now punctuated with whispers of the scandal involving Officer Davis. Many people still couldn't believe that someone they had trusted could do such a thing, but with each passing day, the reality settled in. Some moved on quickly, as small towns often do, while others wrestled with what had happened. Their views of law enforcement irreversibly changed. Jasmine knew she couldn't change what had occurred, no matter how much she wished she could. Davis had faced the consequences of his actions. He had lost his job, his career, and his place in the community. The trial had come and gone, with Davis pleading guilty to theft and misconduct. He had been sentenced to probation, a slap on the wrist compared to the life-altering loss he had already endured. Still, some people questioned whether the punishment was enough. Was it fair? Was it right? Jasmine wrestled with these questions every day. She knew that no sentence, no punishment, could ever truly undo the harm that had been done, not just to her, but to the community that had been forced to confront its own vulnerabilities. The question that lingered in her mind was whether she could ever truly forgive him, and what that forgiveness would mean for her. The most difficult part for Jasmine wasn't the car, or even the betrayal. It was the slow erosion of trust in a place she had once believed in. She had grown up in Willow Creek, had trusted its people, its institutions, and its leaders. But that trust had been shattered when she realized that even the most reliable figures could fall. The officer who had sworn to protect her was now a criminal, and the system that was supposed to uphold justice had failed to see the cracks until it was too late. Jasmine couldn't help but wonder if the signs had been there all along. Were there others who had been harmed by Davis's actions, people who had been too afraid to speak out? The thought weighed heavily on her, but she knew she couldn't carry that burden alone. One afternoon, as autumn began to paint the town in shades of orange and red, Jasmine walked into the local diner. She hadn't been in there for weeks, preferring to stay out of the public eye. But today was different. She had decided it was time to face the town, to stop running from the memory of what had happened. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. The patrons, a mix of regulars and tourists passing through, looked up as she walked in. There was a pause, a moment of tension, thick with unspoken words, but Jasmine held her head high, walked to the counter, and sat down. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, smiled at her. "How's the coffee today?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "Better now that you're here," the waitress replied, filling a cup with fresh brew. "Been wondering when we'd see you again." Jasmine smiled, the weight of the past few months still heavy in her chest, but the warmth of the small town's simple hospitality grounding her. The woman slid the cup toward her, and for a moment, Jasmine felt like things might just be okay. "I've been meaning to talk to you," the waitress continued. "There's been a lot of talk around here about what happened with Davis, and well, I think you deserve to know. A lot of people are proud of you. They think you did the right thing, standing up for what was yours." Jasmine blinked, taken aback by the words. "I didn't do it for praise," she said softly. "I just wanted justice." "I know," the waitress said, "but sometimes people get scared of the truth, scared of what it means for them. They don't always say it, but a lot of folks in this town are grateful you didn't stay silent. You showed them something they needed to see, whether they liked it or not." For the first time in months, Jasmine felt a sense of warmth settle in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear those words, how much she had been looking for validation, even from strangers. It wasn't that she wanted praise, but knowing that there were people in Willow Creek who supported her gave her a sense of peace. As the weeks wore on, Jasmine started to see a shift. The townspeople began to look at her with a different kind of respect, not because she had exposed the wrongdoings of an officer, but because she had faced the consequences of that exposure. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side, And in doing so, she had reminded them of something important. The truth mattered, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was painful. They didn't always have to agree with her, but they respected her courage. And for the first time, Jasmine truly understood the weight of the choice she had made. But the journey of healing wasn't just for the town, it was for her too. She began attending community meetings, volunteering at local events, and finding ways to reconnect with the people who had once been part of her life. Slowly but surely, she started to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. She understood that it would never be the same, that the wounds caused by the betrayal would take years to heal, but there was hope now. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was her home, and in its imperfections, she found a kind of beauty. A reminder that even the smallest towns, the quietest places, had the capacity for growth, redemption, and change. As for Officer Davis, he remained a shadow in the background of her thoughts, a reminder of how easily things could unravel. He had tried to reach out to her, but Jasmine had made it clear to him that their paths had diverged. She had forgiven him in her own way, not because she owed him anything, but because holding on to anger would only continue to hurt her. He was now a part of her past, and though she could never forget what he had done, she had decided not to let him define her future. One day, as she walked through the streets of Willow Creek, the leaves swirling around her feet in the autumn breeze, Jasmine paused at the edge of the park. She looked around, seeing familiar faces, neighbors and friends she hadn't seen in a long time. The town had changed, yes, but in a way, it had also stayed the same. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the town, and for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt at peace. The storm had passed, and though there were scars that would remain, she knew now that they didn't define who she was. The story of the stolen car, the officer's betrayal, and the lessons she had learned through it all would always be a part of her. But she was ready to move forward, to live her life in a town that, despite everything, still held the promise of new beginnings.